Ever since Britain pledged their Challenger tanks, there's been a tug-of-war between Germany and US as which tanks should be pledged first to Ukraine. US defense officials had said Abrams is too complex. Finally, a deal was struck and now we're seeing dozens of tanks, both Leos and Abrams, being pledged. One might ask, so which of the two is better? This video will explain how all of Abrams' deficiencies for Ukraine's battlefield are outweighed by its ability to fulfill the need which no other NATO tank can fulfill. Tanks have helped change the course of wars since World War II, and you can do that too in Call of War, sponsoring this video. It's a free online strategy game where you choose one of up to 100 real countries and play against other human players in real time. There's honestly no limit to what you can achieve in a game. I love it that I can start with a small country, and if my strategy and diplomacy prove right, I can rule the whole of Europe, or even the world. Call of War can be played with the same account on both PC and mobile, and the game is giving new Binkov players a gift. If you click on the link in the description below and make a new account, you'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is available for 30 days only, so try it out now. Back to our video. The M1 Abrams has its advantages and disadvantages compared to other tank types pledged to Ukraine. Many of those are of technical nature. While it's not entirely clear which Abrams variant is going to Ukraine, certain media outlets like The Hill and Politico seem to indicate it's a fairly modern M1A2 subvariant. Yes, there are subvariants to the A2 as well, like the SCP-1 and 2 being prime candidates for Ukraine. One of the stickier points is the fact that those tanks come with depleted uranium plates inserted in their armor package. Those don't get exported outside the US, so it's likely tanks will go through a process where those are taken out and replaced with other materials. Likely quite similar to what Taiwan-bound SEP V2 tanks went through recently. While the protection levels might take a small hit, the SEP V2 is still a very potent tank. It has second-generation thermal sensors both for the gunner and the commander. Most numerous Russian tank, T-72B3, lacks a commander's thermal sight. If Ukraine ends up getting something closer to the M1A1 AIM variant, it will still be useful, as it will be roughly comparable sensor-wise and situational awareness-wise to the Leopard 2A4s and Challenger 2s that Ukraine got. AIM standard tanks were refurbished and modernized after Iraq War in 2003. And given that we're talking about armor standards of the aughties, it's plausible even Abrams M1A1 protection, and let alone A2 SEP protection, is closer to Challenger 2 levels, rather than 1980s Leo 2A4 levels. On the other hand, all tanks have parts of their frontal surfaces which are less armored, meaning all can suffer an unlucky hit after enough hits. Like Leo 2 and Challenger 2, the Abrams does not use an automatic loader, but it does share the gun design with Leo 2, which makes it a better choice for maintenance, as means of maintaining its barrels could be found in Poland and Germany. And unlike the Challenger, which needs its own ammunition, Abrams can freely use NATO standard tank rounds. If the US doesn't give depleted uranium rounds to Ukraine, the second choice would be export model rounds, which are either licensed German designs or US design derived rounds with tungsten penetrators instead of depleted uranium ones. But all those armor and firepower details are really less relevant to Ukraine. They're either good enough or even better when compared to other tanks available to Ukraine. They will all destroy enemy bunkers, suppress enemy formations and various vehicles, which is the main role of the tank, unlike fighting enemy tanks, which will happen less often. Things become a bit more interesting when we get to mobility. While ground pressure-wise Leo 2 still can't be beat, A1 Abrams is better than Challenger 2. Abrams has one wheel more per side than the Challenger, which also aids in ground pressure, though its ground pressure value is still greater than that of Leo 2. But the A2 SEP variant is already behind the baseline Challenger 2. Weights are presented in metric tons. All of that would mean Leos would sink into mud less often than Abrams, which, the more modern and heavier it is, might have even more mobility problems. Abrams has a power plant that produces 1500 horsepower. Given its weight, It's somewhat worse than Leo 2A4, but better than even the basic Challenger 2. Both Leo and Abrams use transmission with 4 forward and 2 reverse gears, but despite the power-to-weight ratio, Abrams still has superior acceleration. That's because Abrams uses a gas turbine, while Leo and Challenger use diesel engines. Shown graph lines depict an engine used in more modern Leo variants than the A4. Yet the actual horsepower and especially torque advantage of the gas turbine is clear. In the crucial stages when a tank is trying to accelerate as quickly as possible from a static position, Abrams should have a fairly large advantage. Gas turbine is a peculiar choice for a tank, as it has some fairly big disadvantages. It gets quite a bit hotter than a diesel engine, which might lead to a bigger thermal signature. Just how will that impact premature detection by the enemy compared to Leo 2 is hard to say though. The gas turbine is on the other hand quieter at a distance. Troops on the battlefield that rely on their ears might not hear one closing in on them. Both the Abrams gas turbine and Leo's diesel engine are multi-fuel power plants. While there are some slight differences, both engines can run both diesel and kerosene and still achieve similar efficiency. Difference being that in the long run the diesel engine might need some more maintenance. Maintenance in itself is one of the bigger issues. Some US officials had stated Abrams is not suitable for Ukraine precisely due to its gas turbine, complexity and maintenance. But that's really a bit of an exaggeration. Gas turbine needs less lubrication than a diesel engine. It's also fairly reliable. The maker of the Abrams turbine claims 2,000 hours of operation for a new turbine before first overhaul. From then on, each subsequent overhaul comes after 1,400 hours. That compares well with some other tank diesel engines, though figures for the modern Leo 2 engine might be even better. One thing that's definitely going against Abrams is its fuel consumption. A gas turbine will always use more fuel compared to a diesel engine. Abrams A1 doesn't actually fall that much behind Leo A4 in terms of autonomy. But that's because Abrams hold over 50% more fuel, 1,900 liters versus 1,200 liters. Now, fuel is expensive, sure. Diesel currently costs 80% more than jet fuel. To fill up an Abrams with diesel, one will pay $1,000 more. But that's not the important metric. Bigger issue would be the number of fuel trucks and crews needed to supply Abrams tanks, compared to the same number of Leo tanks. Here, two metrics are important. One would be how many miles could a unit in Ukraine plausibly cross in a given time period. While in Iraq the US Army was crossing huge distances and sometimes outrunning the supply train, in Ukraine that would rarely happen. The front line is very fortified, and the enemy is more of a peer-level enemy. When maneuvers and breakthroughs would happen, tanks wouldn't run 100 miles or more per day, but more like dozens. So that doesn't make Abrams look as bad. But there's another metric, fuel consumption when idling. And here the Abrams power plant is quite bad. When idling, Abrams fuel usage is close to 3 times bigger, and tanks on the battlefield, even if not moving, can't afford to have their engines turned off. They have to power various components, and they have to be ready to move. While some US Army Abrams have auxiliary power units, refurbished Abrams that might reach Ukraine might not get those. Anyway, it's a given that an Abrams unit will indeed use more fuel and thus will be a greater burden on the logistics, perhaps requiring even over 50% more fuel crews, fuel trucks, etc. But that's just for tanks. There are many other vehicles in any army which all need fuel. Besides tanks, there's usually a few times more other armored vehicles, plus possibly even 10,000 various logistics trucks. Overall, even if Ukraine's army operated, say, 800 Abrams tanks, its fuel needs would go up by perhaps just 1% or so compared to an army operating 800 Leo tanks. Is the Abrams hard to train on? Well, as hard as any other modern NATO tank would be. It's more complex and more high-tech than current Ukrainian tanks, but compared to its other NATO brethren, it's in the same ballpark. There aren't really any systems on it that are drastically different on Leo, aside for the gas turbine, whose depot-level maintenance would have to be done outside Ukraine, but that would be applicable to Leo 2 as well, both due to infrastructure and safety reasons. Will Ukraine get active-duty Abrams? The US Army currently has little over 2,600 Abrams, and 3,400 more in storage. Up to 800 of those are fairly modern AIM and SA standard stored tanks. Those have been through a complete refurbishment after the Iraq War in 2003 and also got modern subsystems. Roughly half of those are ex-US Marine Corps tanks, which have recently and suddenly been retired. The rest of the tanks in US storage should be fairly basic M1A1 tanks, though it's possible some of those have had their armor upgraded with depleted uranium inserts at places. That's a reversible process though. Some 2,600 to 3,000 tanks should be close to the basic A1 models from the late 1980s, but there's been a plethora of other minor modifications from the 1990s. Discerning those is much harder. Those hulls are indeed now 35 or so years old, but for a tank, that's not terribly old. Indeed, Russia has been using their T-72s of similar vintage, refurbishing them and upgrading them to B-3 variants. In the last decade or so, it upgraded over 1,500 of those vehicles. Now, from the US official statements, it seems the US does not intend to send its active-duty tanks. Instead, it will contract refurbishment of older tanks, perhaps ones from the 1990s, or maybe ones that already got a refurbishment post-2003. For that big post-Iraq refurbishment program, over 1,800 Abrams tanks were contracted for complete refurbishment and modernization in a span of under 3 years, bringing their hulls and parts to zero-hour condition, as if they were new builds. The maker of Abrams tanks said in 2010 they refurbished 170 Abrams in a span of 5 months. So the US does have the capability to refurbish a lot of tanks fairly quickly. Not in mere months, sure, but within half a year a fairly steady stream of Abrams could start flooding into Ukraine. Last year, the Abrams manufacturers said they were refurbishing 15 tanks per month, so it would take some time to hire new staff to double that figure. If that's something the US and its allies are ready to pay for. And that is really what it's all about. How many tanks could be sent in what time frame? So the question becomes, can Abrams do better in that regard than Leo 2, its competitor for Ukraine? Large stocks of older vehicles are not something the EU is keeping. Most countries have perhaps dozens to 100 older tanks stored, as storage too costs money. Previous generation tanks like M60 have mostly been cut up and sold as metal. Germany, the biggest holder of surplus Leo tanks, has been working hard to sell its old Leos to other countries during the last 30 years. It even sent some Leos recently to countries which sent T-72s to Ukraine. Furthermore, since 2017 or so, Germany has sought to reinstate and modernize some 68 of its then stored tanks. Accounting for the recent transfers, the 2021 UN Register of Conventional Arms report suggests Germany has 272 Leopards marked as surplus, outside its active-duty military. In addition, 182 even older Leopard 1s are also stored. But the condition of those tanks may leave a lot to be desired. Rheinmetall, the maker company of Leo's gun, stated in 2022 that the German state had 22 Leo 2s and 88 Leo 1s stored at its facilities. Just weeks ago, the company said that those first 22 Leo 2s could be refurbished and delivered to Ukraine by May, but then added that a subsequent batch of another 22 Leos, if sent for refurbishment, would arrive in Ukraine only at the end of 2023, or even at the start of 2024. Which is precisely why Germany is first pledging its active-duty A6 variant tanks. Those are likely the only tanks that can come to Ukraine in time to help fend off possible Russian spring offensives. Spain is another country with a lot of Leo stored. They have 54 Leo 2 A4 stored, but Spain had said their A4s are in such a shape that most can't be used for anything, that they would be a danger to their own crews. Czechia had said no to Spanish tanks when they were buying second-hand tanks due to their poor state. So far, Spain promised just 4 to 6 Leopards in the short term. Canada may have a company worth of excess Leo 2s as well as some 50 even older Leo 1s mothballed. But overall, Leopard 2 totals in NATO are still not looking good. Italy and France, like the UK, have their own tank designs, fielded in small quantities. While unlikely to part ways with the active fleet, they have some stored tanks, but a parallel maintenance system for a unique tank type where perhaps a few dozen or even 100 might be sent, well, that might not be worth it. Of course, any tank can be refurbished, and as the US example showed, if the infrastructure is there, it can be done quickly. But the US has 2,600 Abrams tanks in active service. Just a few years ago, it maintained 3,000. The countries that are likely to send Ukraine Leo tanks do not have as plentiful totals. Among them, they have little under 2,000 Leo 2 tanks in active service. But would they all help out? That's another matter. That list of countries is mostly NATO countries, but it's plausible some would not send tanks. Turkey may be trying to keep their relationship with Russia going, and neither Turkey nor Greece wants to disarm themselves against the other due to their antagonistic history. In early February, Greece said it would not send Leo 2 tanks to Ukraine. It does have hundreds of old Leo 1 tanks in active service. It remains to be seen if it will send any of those. A few countries are added though, like Finland and Sweden, which are trying to get into NATO anyway. But crucially, while the US has over 3,400 Abrams tanks stored, those listed countries have 440 additional Leo 2s in storage. While the US has its own refurbishment facilities, a lot of other countries can't really repair their stored tanks easily, as Spain showed. Such deep refurbishment is done so tanks are sent to Germany to the tank's original maker, or perhaps to countries that were at one time assembling Leo tanks. Given that Germany shrunk its tank fleet a lot, the industrial capacity to refurbish so many tanks in a short time frame is also scaled down, as that statement from Rheinmetall showed. While actual numbers are not public, it might be plausible that it would take a year for under 100 Leo 2s to be taken out of storage across whole Europe, refurbished and sent to Ukraine. But ultimately what's best for Ukraine is that it can get many tanks, any tanks which are at least of 1980s tech level, quickly. There's an evident rush to get at least some tanks in by spring to hold against a possible Russian offensive. That's why Germany and Poland pledged their active duty tanks. And preferably have those tanks be of the same type, so Ukraine doesn't end up with a hodgepodge of British Challengers, French Leclercs, German Leos, US Abrams, and so on. But even all those other tanks combined can't match what the Abrams fleet can offer in pure numbers. Training on new tanks is another thing that may benefit Abrams. Each of those Leo 2 user countries have some capacity to train Ukrainian crews, but due to much smaller fleets in those countries, their training capacities are also much smaller. Training durations have already been announced as cut down from what they usually are in the West. Of course, if an experienced Ukrainian crew requalifies, they don't need as much time. Training has already been announced as a split effort, done in each of the pledger countries, done in multiple languages or likely in imperfect English. And still the overall total would not equal the training capacities that the US could offer for Abrams, due to the larger US tank fleet. But politics of it all would need to be arranged, where other NATO countries would help pay for that training in the US. So if the international politics behind it all could be arranged, Abrams might be the best choice. Sending Abrams means Ukraine could get hundreds of NATO tanks by the end of the year, if funds to US factories are made available and if late delivery penalties are paid to other users waiting for their Abramses. Literally 200 plus Abrams could be sent by the US alone in the first year, without any NATO member having to actually send further active duty tanks to Ukraine. And it means Ukraine can get even more Abramses in 2024 as the production line ramps up, compared to maybe up to 100 stored Leos in the first year and perhaps a bit more in the second year. Even if Germany eventually sends its entire stored tank fleet, it would hit a wall with its limited stocks at some point. While the Abrams stocks could in theory keep sending 400 more Abrams for years, come 2025 or so. Yes, those timetables seem incredible, but there's no way of knowing how long this war might last. Even if the war doesn't last as long, the Abrams still offers more available tanks in the same time period. Of course, that's the theory of it. In reality, such Abrams numbers would require a lot of investment. NATO would have to agree on funding a huge new maintenance center near the Ukrainian border for support of such massive tank fleets. The US is certainly not going to pay for it alone. Actual unwillingness of the US to send its Abrams may in part stem from the fact it's been paying for a large part of Ukraine's defenses already. One may also ask, does Ukraine even need 400 or 800 more tanks in the coming years? That depends on how the war will continue. But Binkov fears it may go on for a long time, unless there's a coup in Russia. Ukraine had over 800 tanks at the start of the war. It got 350 more delivered to date. It captured hundreds of tanks from Russia. Oryx photo archive claims over 500 captured, though it seems the majority of the captured tanks can't really be maintained and used by Ukraine that easily, as certain differences do exist. Very little has been shown of those captured tanks, and an Ukrainian army officer, Ustimenko, said for the Washington Post article that very few of the captured tanks were operational. While the Oryx photo archive lists some 450 Ukrainian tanks as lost so far, one can't really know the full extent of losses. For example, if Ukrainian claim of troops lost is compared to US intelligence claim, and the same ratio, which is twice as big, is applied to tanks, it might suggest Ukraine lost a few hundred tanks more over the 450 figure. That's not to say it's really what happened, but the Oryx archive may not paint a complete picture. It's also plausible that even some of the tanks that aren't lost may not be able to run anymore after a year of heavy use, and that Ukraine simply can't refurbish them fast enough with a war going on. So it's not impossible that Ukraine may in fact have fewer tanks now than it had at the start of the war. Crucially, even if hundreds of tanks are sent, those will have to be coupled with hundreds of other systems, such as more Bradleys and other IFVs and more long-range strike and air defense assets. If all those are sent to be operational within a year, then Ukraine might have enough power on the battlefield to really make a difference when it comes to Ukraine retaking territory. A trickle of tanks and combat vehicles, even at a combined 100 per month, is not nearly as effective, and might ultimately mean much higher casualties in the long run. That's why sending Abrams is the best choice, as it's the only type that can come quickly enough and in high enough numbers. Allow us a few more words about Call of War. There are various maps to play: the European theater, the Pacific one, the US homefront, and only if you can handle it, the entire world map. Matches are methodical and can last for weeks. Call of War is no clickfest. You manage regions and whole countries, steer economy, trade resources, or research over 120 different units. Just look at all these units at hand. Buildings and units in game are historically accurate models. And yes, you can even nuke your opponents, though I'd advise nurturing the right alliances more. There are regular updates to the game and free new content. Premium content is optional, but Call of War gives new Binkov players just that. Use the link in the description below and you'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free.